For 6 magical months in 1893, heaven existed on earth, and they called it the White City. Indeed, it was a wonderland of gleaming classical palaces, pristine gardens, and ethereal lagoons that made Venice look modest by comparison. And each night, thousands of electric lights transformed its waterways into ribbons of liquid silver, while fountains danced beneath stars that seemed to shine brighter within its walls than anywhere else on earth. But like all dreams, this one was destined to end, not with a whisper, but with an inferno that would leave even Chicago's most hardened citizens weeping in the streets. In today's episode, we share the story of the Midwest's most beautiful creation and its subsequent demolition, as we describe. Why Chicago destroyed the most beautiful park in the world. In the waning years of the 19th century, Chicago stood raw and ambitious, a city determined to shed its reputation as nothing more than a meat-processing colossus. Its business leaders, gathering in smoke-filled rooms at the Chicago Club on Monroe Street, saw in the approaching 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage an opportunity that would transform their city. They understood, with the clarity that comes from years of building industrial empires, that hosting a World's Fair could elevate Chicago from a mere commercial powerhouse to a global cultural capital. The task of creating this transformation fell to 3 men whose ambitions matched the scale of the project itself. George R. Davis, a businessman whose penetrating gaze had assessed countless deals, would serve as the fair's Director General. Daniel Burnham, an architect whose very bearing suggested the grandeur of his vision, would orchestrate the greatest architectural assemblage America had yet seen. And Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect whose work in New York's Central Park had already rewritten the relationship between city and nature, would transform a swampy stretch of Jackson Park into a paradise of classical proportion. These men shared more than just professional expertise. They possessed an almost religious conviction in the power of beauty to elevate the human spirit. Burnham, in particular, rejected the practical but prosaic architecture that had rebuilt Chicago after the Great Fire. Instead, he insisted on a radical vision, a gleaming white city of classical proportions that would rise from the Illinois prairie like a mirage. The scale of their ambition became clear in the preliminary drawings. Where others saw an impossibly vast marshland, Burnham sketched colonnades that would stretch longer than any built since ancient Rome. Where city officials saw only a drainage problem, Olmsted envisioned a system of lagoons that would reflect the classical facades like mirrors. Where practical minds worried about Chicago's notorious weather, Davis planned for structures that would dwarf anything previously built in America. Each man brought his own particular genius to the project. Burnham's architectural vision drew on the grandest traditions of European design, yet demanded construction techniques that had never before been attempted. Olmsted's landscape plans required moving entire islands of Earth and transforming the very topography of the lakeshore. Davis's organizational skills would be tested by the need to coordinate thousands of workers and millions of dollars in construction contracts. But even as these 3 visionaries began their work, forces beyond their control were gathering. The American economy was showing signs of strain, with bank failures in the West presaging deeper troubles. The Chicago weather, always unpredictable, threatened to derail their carefully planned construction schedule. And in the political halls of power, enemies of the fair were preparing their own schemes. The visionaries pressed on, knowing that failure would confirm every Eastern skeptic who had sneered at Chicago's pretensions. Success, however, would require them to accomplish something unprecedented in American history. They would need to build an entire city, perfect in every detail, in less than 3 years. The transformation of Jackson Park began in the grey dawn of 1891, when the first survey stakes were driven into the frozen ground. What followed was a construction project of such massive scale that it would have seemed impossible had it not been meticulously documented. Thousands of workers, many of them recent immigrants, labored in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They drained marshes, dredged lagoons, and moved earth by the ton, all while racing against Chicago's merciless weather. Olmsted's vision required reshaping the very land itself. The marshy ground was raised by 6 feet in some places, requiring endless trainloads of fill. His system of lagoons, designed to echo the canals of Venice, demanded precision engineering that had never before been attempted in America. The soil itself had to be enriched, for Olmsted insisted on plantings that would appear to have grown naturally for centuries rather than months. Meanwhile, Burnham's architectural plans called for buildings of such scale that they defied conventional construction methods. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building alone would cover more ground than any structure ever built, its roof requiring an intricate steel framework that pushed contemporary engineering to its limits. The building's classical facades, though temporary, had to appear as permanent as marble, leading to innovations in the use of staff, a mixture of plaster and fibre that could be moulded into any form. The scale of the electrical installation was unprecedented. The fair would use 3 times as much electricity as the entire city of Chicago, requiring a power plant that was itself a marvel of engineering. Miles of copper wire were laid and thousands of incandescent bulbs were installed, at a time when most Americans had never seen an electric light. But it was in the details that the fair's luxury truly emerged. Sculptures were commissioned from the finest artists in Europe and America. Fountains were designed to rival those of Versailles. Gardens were planted with such precision that each flower bed would reach its peak of bloom during the fair's run. Even the benches were designed by architects who treated each one as a small masterpiece of comfort and style. The construction schedule, however, seemed impossible to meet. As winter approached in 1892, vast sections of the grounds remained unfinished. Critics began to suggest that Chicago had attempted too much, that the fair would open to half-completed buildings and muddy grounds. But they had not reckoned with the determination of the men who had set this grand plan in motion. As the opening day drew near, work continued around the clock. Thousands of additional workers were hired, and electric lights were strung so that construction could continue through the night. The sound of hammers and saws never ceased, and the grounds became a 24-hour cascade of activity. In the midst of this controlled chaos, a pattern began to emerge. The White City was taking shape, its buildings rising like a dream against the Chicago sky. But beneath the surface of this magnificent achievement, troubling questions were beginning to arise about what would happen after the fair's brief moment of glory had passed. On the 1st of May, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a golden telegraph key, and the world's Columbian Exposition burst into life. The fountains began to flow, the machinery halls hummed with power, and the world's first Ferris wheel began its stately rotation above the Midway. The White City had become reality, and for the next 6 months, it would capture the imagination of the world. The statistics of the fair's success almost defy comprehension. On a single day in October, 716,881 people passed through its gates, more than the entire population of Chicago at the time. The fair's restaurants served meals to 27,000 people simultaneously. The Ferris wheel alone generated profits of $725,000, equivalent to over $20 million today. But these numbers tell only part of the story. For many visitors, the fair represented their first encounter with electricity, with foreign cultures, with classical architecture, with urban planning on a grand scale. Farm families who had never seen an electric light found themselves in a city where even the smallest pathway was illuminated. Workers who had never left their own states suddenly found themselves discussing art with visitors from Paris and Vienna. The fair's influence extended far beyond its grounds. Architects returned to their home cities with new visions of what American cities could become. Manufacturers who had exhibited their products found themselves flooded with orders from across the country. The fair's architecture inspired a generation of public buildings, from state capitals to post offices, all echoing the classical proportions of the White City. But even at the height of its glory, signs of impending trouble appeared. The Panic of 1893, which had begun just as the fair opened, was spreading through the American economy like a slow poison. Banks were failing, businesses were closing, and the nation was sliding into what would become one of its worst depressions. The fair's magnificent buildings, designed to last only for the duration of the exposition, were beginning to show wear from the hundreds of thousands of visitors who passed through them daily. Most ominously, questions were being raised about the fair's future. The buildings, though magnificent, were temporary structures. The staff that gave them their gleaming white appearance was already beginning to crack and weather. The carefully maintained grounds required an army of workers to preserve their perfection. and Chicago's harsh weather was taking its toll on structures that had never been intended to last more than a few months. As autumn approached and the fair entered its final weeks, a sense of urgency gripped many visitors. They understood, perhaps only subconsciously, that they were witnessing something that would never be seen again. What they could not have known was that forces were already in motion that would lead to one of the most dramatic transformations in American urban history. The first blow to the White City's perfection came not after its closing, but during the fair itself, in a tragedy that would forever haunt Chicago's memory. On the 10th of July 1893, smoke began curling from the top of the cold storage building, the five-story marvel known as the greatest refrigerator on Earth. What began as wisps of smoke from its cupola would transform into one of the deadliest fires in Chicago's history. The building's fatal flaw lay in its design, a 200-foot iron chimney, masked by a wooden tower for aesthetic purposes, with a cupola perched precariously close to the flue. Firefighters had already warned about the structure, with the World's Fair Fire Department's acting chief declaring it a miserable fire trap. Prescience would prove tragically accurate. That July afternoon, as an estimated 50,000 fairgoers gathered to watch, 20 firefighters ascended the tower. The crowd's initial cheers turned to horror as they witnessed the unfolding catastrophe. Debris from the burning cupola had fallen into the void between the wooden walls and smokestack, beyond the protective fire brick that extended only 70 feet up the tower. The firefighters, trapped at the summit, faced an impossible choice: jump 60 feet or risk descent on ropes that could burn through at any moment. 17 lives were lost, including 13 firefighters, marking the fair's darkest hour. But an even more spectacular destruction awaited the White City after its closing. On the 8th of January 1894, fire erupted again, this time at the top of the casino. Winter winds whipped the flames northward along the peristyle, creating a wall of fire and smoke that stretched 500 yards, its reflection dancing on the frozen surface of the Grand Basin. The Grand Arch crumbled as the inferno advanced, consuming the music hall in its path. Through it all, the French statue of the Republic stood defiant, its uplifted arms silhouetted against the inferno like some ancient goddess of destruction. As firebrands from the burning peristyle rained down on the manufacture's building's vast roof, the White City's destruction became a perverse echo of its creation. The same classical proportions that had made it magnificent now served as channels for the fire's advance. The same staff that had given it its gleaming white surface now fueled the flames. Even the lagoons that Olmsted had designed for beauty now reflected the city's destruction, turning the Grand Basin into a mirror of fire and ice. The panic of 1893 had already left many of the fair's financial backers unable to fulfill their commitments. The city of Chicago, grappling with economic crisis, could not maintain the ground's immaculate state. The army of gardeners, maintenance workers, and security guards that had kept the White City functioning was gradually dismissed. Proposals for preserving the remaining buildings emerged and faded. Some suggested converting them into museums or educational institutions. Others proposed maintaining them as a permanent amusement park. But the buildings themselves, constructed of temporary materials, made such plans impractical. As the 19th century drew to a close, only fragments survived. The statue of Christopher Columbus from the cold storage building, preserved by the Chicago Fire Department as a memorial to their fallen brothers, and a few buildings that had escaped the flames only to face slower decay. But even as the physical structures crumbled, a new force was rising in American architecture. The classical ideals that had inspired the White City were giving way to different visions. Visions that would transform not just Chicago, but the very nature of American cities themselves. The final demolition of the World's Fair grounds marked more than just the end of a brief, glorious moment in American history. It represented the triumph of practicality over idealism, of permanence over temporary splendor, of the real city over the dream city. The process was not quick or simple. It stretched over years, as building after building succumbed to demolition crews or simple neglect. The peristyle, which had survived both winter storms and the Great Fire, stood as a lonely sentinel until the 1920s. Its classical columns, though deteriorating, remained a powerful reminder of what had once been. When it was finally demolished, Many Chicagoans felt they were witnessing the end of an era. The removal of its massive columns, each weighing several tons, required techniques that would later be used in the construction of Chicago's first skyscrapers. Yet even as the physical remnants of the White City disappeared, its influence spread in unexpected ways. The fair had introduced Americans to a new vision of urban possibility. The City Beautiful movement, inspired directly by the White City, transformed American urban planning. Civic centers from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. were designed to capture something of the fair's grandeur. The fair's technological legacy proved equally lasting. The widespread use of electricity at the fair helped convince Americans that this new power source was both safe and practical. The introduction of new construction techniques, particularly in the use of steel framing, directly influenced the development of the modern skyscraper. Even the Ferris wheel, though long gone from Chicago, became the prototype for similar attractions worldwide. Jackson Park itself underwent a transformation. Where the White City had stood, new institutions took root. The Field Museum, though eventually relocated, began in the fair's Fine Arts building. The Museum of Science and Industry, housed in the rebuilt Palace of Fine Arts, became a permanent reminder of the fair's commitment to progress and education. But perhaps the fair's most profound legacy lay in what it revealed about American possibilities. For 6 months, millions of visitors had experienced a vision of what a city could be, not just in its architecture and technology, but in its ability to bring people together, to elevate the human spirit, to suggest that beauty and progress could coexist. More than a century later, as Chicago continues to evolve, traces of the White City's influence can still be found, not in physical structures, but in the enduring belief that cities can be more than mere collections of buildings. They can be, as the White City briefly was, works of art that transform not just the landscape, but the very lives of those who inhabit them. And now, we'd love to see you in the comments. Are you a native of Chicago or the broader Midwest? And had you heard this iconic tale before? We always look forward to hearing the personal thoughts of our viewers, so be sure to leave us a few sentences below. With that said, thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Mansions. And cheers, until next time.